Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with a video that is all about my all-time favorite books. It occurred to me that I had not done this in a while. In fact, I went back and looked. The last time that I posted a video about my all-time favorite books was in 2019, and I am just such a different reader than I was then. And this year has been really, I think, the greatest year that I have had on booktube in terms of reading. I have rated so many books 5 stars. I have found things that I would say are favorites of the year, but that really caused me to reflect on books that I have also called favorites of the year. And I think calling a book a favorite of the year never really indicates that it's going to enter the echelons of a favorite book of all time for me. And so this was actually really hard to put together because I want my favorite books of all time to be books that I think about frequently. And I feel like that is not as many as what I might think. And it's certainly not as many as I've rated 5 stars over the years. So this is something that's kind of making me want to go back and reevaluate how I rate books. But I feel like this is an exercise that I should probably do annually. I should really give it a look and I should really go over things that I think are my favorites year to year, because I do truly think that I have changed very rapidly as a reader, especially in my time on booktube. So this is something that I hope to do every year. Hopefully I can remember to do it. Something that I think I did in my original favorite books of all time video is I included things like poetry because I think I included Dante there. And I think most of y'all know Dante is one of my favorites of all time. If we were to include poetry, we would be sitting here for 7 years. And so I actually have done a video that is all about my favorite epic poetry. And that's normally what I would say is something that becomes a favorite for me. It has to be an epic poem. So I'll link to that up above, but that's not going to be included here. So I really started to think about books that are really on my mind all the time. And it's interesting, I think my favorites have stayed the same in a lot of ways, but I do think I've added a few new ones. So let's go on and get into my list. This will be in no particular order. I do have an all-time favorite, and so I will save that for the very last. First, let's start with series. I think it's very hard for me to judge a series unless it is complete. And I think it's very hard for an individual book in a series to stand out to me. And so it's very difficult, I think, for books that are in series to become favorites for me because I have to judge them based on where the entire series went. And so these are actually series that I would say I give 5 stars as a whole. The first one is The Last Kingdom by Bernard Cornwell. I think most of y'all knew this was gonna be here. I also have an entire video where I reviewed this series, but this is a 13-book long historical fiction series that is set during the Viking invasions of Britain. And it follows a fictional main character named Uhtred, who is the love of my life. And we meet so many really important historical figures throughout this series. This series actually does cleave pretty closely to the historical record. And when things are changed, Bernard Cornwell is pretty upfront about it. This is such an interesting series to me. It's definitely the longest series on my list. And in general, it's probably one of the longest series that I have ever read. And Bernard Cornwell as an author, I would say, doesn't do a lot for me. I have tried his other series and I have never really been able to get into it or get attached to it in the same way. A lot of the reason that this series works is the main character, Uhtred. You live in his head for all 13 books, and it is just absolutely brilliant. And I think also the ending was so incredible. The ending was so positive that it really made the series as a whole go up for me. I was really worried about the end here. This occupies a very special place in my heart because alongside the television show Vikings, this really sparked my interest in the time period. This is partially why I went to study in Denmark, was this in the Vikings television show. So this has really been a series that has impacted me in terms of my own personal life, things that I'm really interested in. This series introduced me to Alfred the Great, and I am so thankful to it. It's hard to recommend a series that you know is 13 books long, but gosh, this one is worth it. And I just think about it all the time. This is one where the characters have come alive to me, and you think about them the way that you think about real friends, and that's what's so special in my opinion. Speaking of people who are real to me, let's talk about The Infernal Devices by Cassandra Clare. I think I would say objectively the third book in this trilogy is the strongest and is the reason that I would give the entire series 5 stars. This is part of the overarching Shadowhunter series, and technically, I guess I could have said that. I guess I could have said the entire Shadowhunter world could be here, but these are special. And if I'm being honest with you, this series is possibly my second favorite of all time. Just in general, my second favorite book of all time is maybe the third book in this trilogy. And I say the third book is the strongest because of the ending. The ending is so incredible, but it doesn't work if it doesn't have the groundwork of those first two books. I think about this series once a day. This is my Roman Empire. This is at its heart a love triangle story. What's the plot here? Who cares? I surely don't. This is about the characters for me. Will, Jim, and Tessa, I love them. I love them with my whole entire heart. I have never in my life been as emotionally affected by a book as I was by this third one. And I think about the fact that it made me so emotional all the time, especially when I rate other books 5 stars. I often compare them to the Infernal Devices. Was I that emotionally invested? Did I feel that much? This was so interesting to me because they were so real. And I guess it stands out because this is technically part of a longer series. And so I think it's interesting that the connection I felt for the Infernal Devices has not been reflected with any of the other kind of interlocking Shadowhunters books. It was just exclusively with this trilogy. There have been other books in the Shadowhunters world that I've given 5 stars and that I loved, but it was these for me. Truly, this is literature. This is the one I feel like people will judge me for. I don't care. These are objectively some of my favorite books of all time. This is my favorite trilogy of all time. I said what I said. I'm not the only one to feel this way. I think a lot of people felt the emotional pull of this trilogy, but it really, really affected me. And I still think about them. I still think about Will, Jim, and Tessa all the time, almost as if they're real people that I could check in with. I also want to include Wolf Hall here, but this one is a strange one because I would say 100% Wolf Hall, the first book in this trilogy, is the strongest and is the objective favorite for me of the 3. I wouldn't rate Bring Up the Bodies or The Mirror and the Light 5 stars without the love that I have for Wolf Hall. So this is also a historical fiction trilogy that is about the Tudor period. It's from the perspective of Thomas Cromwell. This one gets 5 stars based on the writing alone. It's also operating in a time period that I find really interesting. I'm a Wars of the Roses girly, but there's enough references to it in this to really make me excited, to really get me engaged. I've never really been that into Henry VIII or even the 6 wives of Henry VIII for that matter. I know that that's a pet time period for a lot of women specifically. That is just a time period that they really love. It's never been that interesting to me, but again, as we move out of the medieval period, my interest kind of wanes just a little bit. But this is dealing with the most interesting time period in terms of Henry VIII's reign for me, which is Catherine of Aragon, then going into Anne Boleyn and her kind of overturn. These books are so brilliantly written. It's unbelievable to me, and this is a case where you see why a book was an awards darling. These books are just so quotable. They're so richly and wonderfully written. Honestly though, Wolf Hall is the one that stands out above the rest. That's the first book in the trilogy. This is, of course, a series that I think is probably stronger if you get the entire picture because it is telling the story of Thomas Cromwell's life. But there's something about that first book that just had lightning in a bottle. If this is one you have never read, do yourself a favor and pick it up very soon because it really is fantastic. Also in my series section, I wanted to talk about the Raven Boys, but this is another one where I would say one book in this series stands out above the rest. I can't even objectively say this is a favorite series for me, so this is kind of bridging us over just into regular novels. But Blue Lily, Lily Blue, which is the 3rd book in this series, this is an award winner in my heart. This is one of my favorites for kind of the same reason as the Infernal Devices. There's something about the characters here that makes them so real and vibrant. There's also something achingly beautiful about the romance that's at the heart of this one. I think about lines in this book all the time. One of the romances of this series was an excruciating slow burn that could have even been slower and I still would have been engaged in it. This is really the series that taught me I could enjoy romance because I was there for it every step of the way. The Raven Boys wants to be a lot of things. It's kind of an urban fantasy because it's set in our world. It's dealing with ley lines, with dead Welsh kings, there are witches in it. There's just something for everyone in this series, and objectively a lot of this series is weird, but I think this is the series that probably birthed in all of us a love for weird books. The reason I would say I can't put the series as a whole here is just how absolutely disappointing the last book in this series was. I mean, literally, I still remember sitting there kind of staring into space, trying to process what had just happened in those last few chapters, because I do think this is a series where the author had some great ideas and knew the vibes, knew the aesthetic. That was really important to her, and that's important to me too, as y'all know. But honestly, I don't think she knew how to end it. And so to me, the ending lets this whole entire series down, and I've never actually revisited it. So this is one I wanted to tentatively put on the list just because it still is in my mind all the time. I constantly compare romance books to this book specifically, but it's one that I've always feared would kind of go down for me if I did actually reread it. So this is definitely a series I would like to reread, but again, it's absolutely beautifully written. It's incredible. This was formative for me. Just kidding, that actually wasn't the last of the series. I just found the other one, and that is the Grisha Trilogy by Leigh Bardugo. I don't care, judge me for this. Everyone loves Six of Crows. Everyone says objectively Six of Crows is so much better than the Grisha Trilogy. Okay, maybe it is. Maybe it is technically better written, especially because it's in third person. But this is a first person fantasy trilogy that is very cliche. It is just full of everything that you want out of a fantasy book. And there's something very nostalgic about that, which I think is why it works so well for me. This is a book series that I loved when I was younger, and I have reread it in recent years, and I have actually loved it even more as an adult. This is a trilogy where I don't think the books can be judged individually. For me, it's the whole entire story. Talk about romance, though. Talk about romance. And talk about the emotional impact of the final book in this series. I have never been so upset, except possibly in the Infernal Devices. That was extreme pain. This was relatively minor compared to that. But again, I think the through line here, and the through line with all of these, is just the investment that you have in the characters. And this one is something that again stands out to me because there's now a nostalgia factor since this series has technically continued on. This world has continued on. And characters from this trilogy continue to pop up again and again. And there's just something that makes you feel really warm inside when you see their names, when you hear from them again. It's actually kind of emotional in a nostalgic way for me. So this is a series that is a sentimental favorite, but it's still a favorite series. These books hold up, and in some ways they're better than what you remember them as. This series also has the Darkling, and what can I say to that? The problem with wanting makes us weak. Oh my gosh, it lives rent-free in my head. This is a more recent addition to my list, and this is a book that I will be interested to see if it continues to pop up on a favorites list for me as years go by. But right now, this is a book that is just so present for me. It's just a really special one, and I knew this kind of immediately. Most of my favorite books of all time are books that were lightning strike moments for me, and I knew kind of right off the bat that I was really going to be down bad. This book is no exception. It's also historical fiction. I feel like a lot of historical fiction has wound up here, but that's Booth by Karen Joy Fowler. This is a literary historical fiction, let's say, kind of in the vein of Wolf Hall, but this is about the Booth family. Most famously, John Wilkes Booth assassinated President Lincoln in 1865, but this book really has very little to do with him specifically as a person. This is giving you a glimpse into the rest of the family, and the Booths were a family of Shakespearean actors, so there is a really theatrical quality to the writing here and to their interactions as characters that I think is really magical. This was spellbinding to me. The writing here, absolutely gorgeous. I think a lot of what the book wanted to say on a deeper level was also really interesting in terms of how it skirted around the issue of John Wilkes Booth and didn't really want to give him any attention. I thought that was really great and really interesting. This one shocks me. When this came out last year and I read this, I was just blown away, and I thought for sure this one is going to wind up on the Booker. This one is going to win some awards, and I do think it was nominated for several things. In fact, I think it was nominated for the Booker, but it didn't make it to the short list. I read this thinking this book should be winning all of the awards. Every award out there should be given to this book. And I'm still shocked that it really wasn't the awards darling that I predicted it to be. This is gorgeously written, and the characterization is really interesting. She also has some ticks to her writing, and there's something that she does kind of specifically for each family member that really makes it clear when we go into their perspective. This was brilliant to me. I mean, absolutely brilliant. And I think about this book all the time. It's a book that I actually wish I had annotated. And I remember thinking that during the reading process, that I thought I should be annotating this because so much of this was so quotable. We also have Daughter of the Forest. And I normally would have saved this for towards the very end because I have always considered this maybe in my top 2. It has been edged out. And I'm also really due for a reread of this. This is a book that I also kind of am scared of rereading just because I don't know if it's going to hold up. This is historical fantasy that is about the Fae. It's about medieval Ireland, and it is a retelling of the Seven Swans. So our main character, Sorcia, her brothers are turned into swans by her evil stepmother, and she has to do a certain task in order to free them from this curse. The book is really so much more than that. And in fact, if you're not really a fantasy reader, this one will work well for you because I don't think the fantasy elements are that in your face. And I remember wishing that there was just a little bit more of the Fae in this. But again, the characters here, again, the romance, actually. It's so funny that before this year, I would never have told you that I was a romance reader or that romance was a component of the story that I was searching for or that compelled me to move forward with something. But clearly, when I think about some of my favorite books of all time here, romance has been a key element of my enjoyment in the stories. And this one is no exception. I think this romance is the best that Juliet Marillier has ever written. It is swoon-worthy. It is just absolutely beautiful to me. And these characters, again, just became real. And I would find myself thinking about Sorcia during the day for months afterwards, like, I wonder how she's doing. I should check in with her, like she was real. This book is really long, and so objectively, we spent a really long amount of time with her. And it was also a really long time in her life. So it felt like you grew with her as a character. This is a really special book, and I think it is objectively Juliet Marillier's greatest. Nothing has ever come close to this for me with her. It's so much harder to speak about books that you love that have no flaws than books that you had a problem with, but truly, I had no complaints with this. And this book is so long that objectively, I do think you feel like at a certain point, it's like you've read 2 different books in one. The first half of the book is so very different from the second half, and I kind of think that's the brilliance of this one. Let's talk about In the Woods by Tana French. I can hear you asking, Jenny, why didn't you include this in your series section? It's because, believe it or not, after years and years, I still have not finished this series. I don't know what's wrong with me, but also because I think the first 2 books in this series are absolutely brilliant. But when I carried on with the series, books 3 and 4, and I think even 5 were rather disappointing to me compared to these. They felt very run-of-the-mill compared to the first 2 books. Now, everyone loves The Likeness, which is the second book in the Dublin Murder Squad series. It's not this one. In the Woods is the first book in the Dublin Murder Squad series, and we are following a detective who went missing for a time when he was a child, and they find a dead body in the same area where he went missing all those years ago. And an archaeological team actually found this body. And so the theme throughout this entire book is how the past can still impact you. This was so much more than just your average murder mystery or even police procedural. Again, gorgeously, gorgeously written. This is a book that I wish I was annotating. I'm due for a reread of this as well. But this was utterly fantastic to me. And I want to say in defense of this book, because some people will say you can really figure out what the ending is going to be. You know who killed the person fairly early on. That's fine by me. I'm really not reading crime thrillers or mysteries in order to figure it out before somebody else in the book. That's fun, but that's not necessarily why I'm reading a thriller, and it's certainly not why I was reading this, because I had watched the television show adaptation of this book before I picked it up. So I knew exactly where this one was going, and the story wasn't lessened by that at all. I didn't feel like this one went down because I didn't have the mystery. I would say of every book that is on my favorites list, This one is probably here more so for the prose than for the characters. I think Wolf Hall is kind of the same way. The character work is interesting in this one, and I love Rob Ryan. I'm obsessed with him, the main character of this. I know he's kind of a cad, but I still really like him. This one was just so interesting thematically, and the writing was so beautiful that I just was lost in it, and I think about this one all the time. So this is definitely one of my favorites. If you had asked me a couple of weeks ago what my favorite books were, I don't know that I would have named this next one off the top of my head, but when I was giving it a thought, this book really floated to the top for me as a favorite of all time, and that's My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix. Please don't click off. I love this book. This book has a lot of heart. I think when people are thinking of Grady Hendrix and maybe just horror in general, you're expecting something kind of campy, you're expecting something kind of gory, something scary that you can read here and there and you just move on from. This book gave me a hangover. It felt like I couldn't move on from it. It felt like I couldn't move on from the characters. I think this was just a really beautiful book, and this is exactly what I think horror should be, because this is examining something larger, but it couched it in horror elements. So this is about a girl who's been possessed by a demon, and her best friend knows this because she starts to act really differently one day. And so in general, this book is just really about female friendship. It's about their friendship specifically, but it's also just in general a metaphor for teen girls and the friendships that you have in high school that are formative for you. This one really caught me off guard. I expected to enjoy it, but I didn't expect to love it. This is clearly Grady Hendrix's best book, but it's also just in general one of my favorite books of all time. I think about it frequently, especially when I'm thinking about friendships, because when I'm reading other books and I see girls being friends, sometimes it just doesn't feel authentic to me. And there's something about this one that really tapped into the teen brain, first of all, but also to just in general, the teen girl experience. I just thought this one was really, really brilliant. We're at my top two, and these actually are locked in. These are my two favorite books of all time. And technically we have another recent read. I would be interested to know again if this one will rate highly for me in years to come, but I don't see how it's not possible. This was literally electrifying to me. When I was reading this, I knew immediately my life had been changed. I was never going to be the same, and that's Demian by Hermann Hesse. I read this book last year because BTS, the K-pop group, have an entire album that is written around concepts from Demian, and they also have a music video, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, their best song and their best music video in my opinion, that is based on Demian and actually is in a way an adaptation of this book. I had never heard of it before getting into their music. And a lot of ARMY, a lot of fans of BTS have said you just understand their music so much more and you understand that album specifically by reading this book. And I really dreaded it, actually. I thought I was just going to make myself read it for my K-pop reading project, and then I would move on, because I remember being forced to read Siddhartha in school, and I thought that was awful. Now I wonder, was I wrong? Because now Hermann Hesse is one of my favorite authors ever. I have loved everything that I have read from him. All of them have been given 5 stars. There has been nothing like this, though. This is a coming-of-age story that was written around World War I. World War I figures relatively prominently in the back half of the book, and this is a very solemn book, I want to say. First off, it's very philosophical, it's very deep, but I am telling you, everything it says was just unbelievably relatable to me in a way, but also just electrifying. It was the first time that I had read some of these concepts put into words that I think I could understand. It's brilliant to me. It's basically about kind of the loss of innocence when you stop being a child and you move into adulthood. And our main character recognizes that that is happening in his life. There's something so surreal about this book. It's not going to work for everyone. I know there are a lot of people out there who hate this one, but my gosh, it worked for me. Again, this is really up here more for the writing. I think this is really objectively the book that is on my favorites list that is here entirely for the prose. This is stunningly beautiful. And you know, if it's as beautiful as this is in translation, I just can only imagine what the original German is like. This is a stunning stunning work of fiction. I don't know, truly, I don't know why we are studying Siddhartha in schools when we could be studying this, because this to me is another book that really tapped into the teen experience in an interesting way, and in a way that I thought was relatable, that I thought really exposed a lot of what you go through. That's the time in your life when you're feeling emotions at a height that you probably never will again. And I think Demian and My Best Friend's Exorcism really dealt with those themes in such a nuanced way. I did annotate this, and not a page went by that I wasn't highlighting something. I had a color code system. This was just brilliant to me, and it instantly became one of my favorite books of all time. Number one, if you have been on my channel for any length of time, you know what I'm going to say. My favorite book of all time is the book that I have always said is my favorite, and that is Interview with the Vampire. I am holding up the first 3 books here because I got them in a bind up, and once upon a time, I would have told you the first 3 books in the Vampire Chronicles series were my favorite books of all time. But when I'm being objective, when I'm really giving it some thought, Interview is the special book here. Interview is the lightning strike moment. I read this for the first time when I was in, I think, the 8th grade. I remember we were going on our field trip to Washington, D.C., and I had this exact edition out from the library, and I was reading this for the first time. I think there's a lot to be said for reading Interview at a formative age, especially when you're on the cusp of your teenage years, because there's something so brilliantly emo about Interview with the Vampire that is not captured anywhere else in Anne Rice's writing to the same degree, in my opinion. But I've always been a vampire girly, and this was just a matter of time. I remember I watched the film adaptation with Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise, and my mom told me, you know, that was a book. And I was like, what? A book? Little did I know the book completely overtakes the film. The film did what it could. It's a decent adaptation of this story, but so much of Interview with the Vampire is cerebral. It's philosophical. This is a book that I would tell you, by definition, is just one of those books with no plot, just vibes. It is all about the aesthetic. It is all about the human question, what makes us human, what makes us sinful. It's about religion. It's also about love. Sexuality is examined so interestingly here. This book has it all. And this is also the book that I would say I have reread the most in my life. I have reread this, I think, 10, maybe even 15 times, because there was a time in my life that I reread it every Thanksgiving. Don't ask me why, I don't know. I was always rereading this at Thanksgiving, and so I'm kind of feeling like I'm due for a reread. The rest of this series is really, I think, the reason why people talk about Anne Rice, because Lestat is the main character of the rest of the Vampire Chronicles series, but Louis is the main character of Interview with the Vampire. Louis really hates himself. He's a very brooding, self-hating vampire, which is my type. That's the type of vampire that I'm interested in reading about. Lestat wants to have fun, and he enjoys it. And so, objectively, I can see why people enjoy other books in this series more, because Lestat is such a vibrant and really wonderful character. To me, Emo Louis, he's really going through things that I think everyone goes through, not just vampires who are dealing with the human question. Louis is still very human to be a vampire. I think you're reading Lestat, and you're reading Lestat's books because they're cathartic, because they're fun, and you want to see someone acting like a vampire. I think Louis causes you to look a little bit more internally at yourself and at choices that you have made. He's far more relatable, and he's far more human than the other vampires in this series. And that's what makes Interview with the Vampire, to me, the most brilliant book ever written. Honestly, I will take no critique on it. You could talk about Interview with the Vampire in thousands of different ways, and they would all be correct. This book just continues to give, even almost 50 years after its initial publication. This is my favorite book of all time. So those were all of my favorite books of all time. This was really hard to narrow this down, and in some cases it was actually really hard to come up with something. I felt like I can't just say only 5 books, because 5 really came to the top for me. I would say Interview, Demian, The Infernal Devices, the Grisha Trilogy, and My Best Friend's Exorcism were actually the 5 that initially came to mind for me. And so if you want to just take my top 5, that's them, definitely. I would love to know down below what you think of these books. I would love to know your favorite book of all time, but that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.